Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to English 454. In the previous lecture, we have been discussing the function of poetry, the nature of poetry, and Wordsworth's idea about the purpose or the end of the poetry. We discussed that according to Wordsworth, poetry was better than all the sciences, whether it was history or philosophy or it was plain science. We discussed that Wordsworth believed that science dealt with the naked fact. It dealt with the collection of the facts. It does help you in contemplating God and getting near to God. It helps you explaining the universe. But he believes that just science for the sake of science, or science for the sake of collection of facts, or just being a group of facts, it's not good enough. He believes that it makes the man, a slave of these facts. He believes poetry is far superior than this kind of science. He believes that poetry, it tells you, it teaches you, it frees you, it gives you pleasure, it makes you think. So he believed that poetry is superior to the sciences. Why? Because poetry is going to release you from the prison the sciences create for you. He believes science tells you to think, but it just tells you to use your intellect. It does not make you an intellectual. It makes you a slave of this factual life. You will only deal with the way things are. You would just explain the things. You would just look at things how they appear to be. Because what he says, which a scientist could murder just to dissect an animal, just to understand the functionings of the body of any animal or a human being for that matter. So for Wordsworth, science was not that great a deal as the age was predicting at that time. He believed in poetry, and he believed that the aim and the purpose of the poetry was to provide pleasure. It was the ultimate aim, but it was not an aim that had to be looked down upon. According to Wordsworth, giving pleasure was not something so simple. It was not something that you can easily do. In order to provide pleasure, a poet had to study so much of human being. You had to understand the man. You understand the man with the capital M, A, and N. You have to understand his passions. You have to understand the intricacies of human mind and human passion and the feelings that brew in the human heart. You have to understand the implications, the impulses, the instincts. You have to understand how man behaves in certain situations, how objects around man, they behave with the human being. What is the result of this action and reaction that goes on? What kind of passions are produced in human beings? There are multiple possibilities when you're trying to study a human mind or the human heart or the human being in itself. So it's not an easy job. There's so many facets to it. There's so many sides to it. There's so many angles to look at it. And that is why studying human being and trying to provide pleasure to that human being is no mean feat. It's not something small. It's not something trivial. It's a great job. And a poet should feel that he is at that exalted job, that he has that exalted job, he has that high strata in the society. He should not be ashamed of being a poet. अच्छा, और इसके अलावा वर्ड्सवर्थ ने ये चीज़ भी डिस्कस की थी कि how is it different from history and philosophy? How is it superior from history and philosophy? History में you're dealing with a particular truth, और philosophy में you're dealing with the general truth. Poetry के केस में ये होता है कि आप particular से भी deal कर रहे हैं और आप universal से भी deal कर रहे हैं. आप you tell people the universal or the general truths by giving them particular examples. So अगर एक चीज़ में दो डिफरेंट चीज़ों की बेसिक एलिमेंट्स आ जाते हैं तो वो चीज़ उससे ऑफ कोर्स सुपीरियर हो जाती है. सो दैट मेक्स पोइट्री सुपीरियर देन हिस्ट्री और साइंस. अच्छा, फिर वर्ड्सवर्थ हैड टू फोकस ऑन व्हाई ही हैड चोजन रस्टिक लाइफ, बिकॉज ही बिलीव्ड कि जो रस्टिक लाइफ है इट मेक्स मैन बिकम more natural. It makes its elemental passions, its elements, its basic needs, basic desires, basic personality, basic nature more obvious. When you live in the cities, there's so many constraints, there's so many demands on your personality, on your soul. Your soul is, it's fogged by the life that you lead in a city. So when you live in the nature or near the nature sinks into your soul. It becomes a part of your soul. Your soul reverts to its original form, and the original form is far more preferred than the artificial form that is achieved when you're living in a city. So Wordsworth strongly believes that man has to be the subject matter of poetry. For him, man, the individual man, the common man, was the most important of all beings. He did not believe in focusing on the kings, and he did not believe in focusing on the kings and the queens and the princes and the nobles and the barons and the dukes. He believed that common man was the most important to be focused on, and he believed that poets who do not focus on common man, और जिनकी पोएट्री का बहुत बड़ा हिस्सा common man की ऊपर based नहीं है, they can't call themselves poets, because this man is so important. It's a part of the nature, and nature is part of that man, and both of them, nature and man, are part of God. So when you live near nature, when you live in nature, you come to realize this truth, and when you realize this truth, it makes you happy, it makes you ecstatic, and that ecstaticness and that ecstasy and that pleasure that you get out of this truth is the sole purpose of poetry. So it has to be man, it has to be rustic man, it has to be written in the form of, or in the language which is close to the heart of the common man. He believes that he has to follow certain meter, he has to follow certain rhyme scheme, but the meter and the rhyme scheme would be there only to contain the state of excitement. He does not want that excitement to go out of bounds. He doesn't want to create an overbearing excited state in the human being. Just to contain that excitement, just to restrict it, just to make it natural and normal, he uses meter. But he does not believe in the artificial language. He does not believe in the poetical diction. He says that he uses nature. He could have written in prose, but he chooses poetry just to add charm. Meter adds charm to it. Meter adds pleasure to it. Just for that sake he has used meter, and that's for this sake only he has used poetry. He sees no difference between poetry and prose, and he does not think that there has to be a difference in the subject matters, and he does not think that there has to be a difference in the language used in poetry or in prose. We have to discuss today the theory of poetic diction given by Wordsworth. Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction was a result of a desire to find a suitable language for the new territory of human life, which was conquering for period treatment. अच्छा, इससे पहले जो ज़बान इस्तेमाल हो रही थी, we all know that, we have discussed it so many times, that Augustans used a specific diction. वो antiquity की language इस्तेमाल करते थे, वो antiquity के principles भी use करते थे, और इन principles को और इन languages को वो very strictly follow करते थे, and they had no room for experimentation. Wordsworth ने इस चीज़ को change किया था, और Wordsworth ने आके कहा था कि I want to use the language that is understood by the common man and that is used by the common man, which is used in the regular day-to-day conversation. ठीक है? The problem that arises here is that they had to find a language that was suitable enough. They had to find a language that was suitable enough for the poetical diction of the poems that were now being created. जो इस period की treatment थी poetry की, उसके लिए it was good enough, suitable enough. अब इसकी treatment क्या थी period की? It was moving away from the classes. It was moving away from the predecessors, that is Augustine's, the new classes. It was treating a different subject, and it was treating a different phenomena as well. So इसकी language भी of course different होनी चाहिए थी. So he brought out the lyrical ballads with a view to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and the lower classes of society is adapted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. अब वो lyrical ballads में उसने यही तो experiment किया, that is what he's saying here. Preface उसने लिखा ही इसलिए था ना, ताकि वो आपको explain कर सके कि जो उसने language इस्तेमाल की है, जो उसने subject matter use किया है, जो उसके characters हैं, वो ये क्यों हैं? Why does he choose simple men? Why does he choose simple language? And why does he choose or did he choose these simple rustic life? So he is explaining this, and he says that he believes that he wants to assess how successful it would be to use the language of conversation, how successful it would be to use the language of the lower classes or the middle classes for the sake of poetic creation. Would it be appropriate enough? Would it serve the purpose? Would it create the pleasure that is the absolute end of poetry? Would people be happy to read about it? Would it have the same kind of effect different kind of poetical diction would have? Is it serving the purpose? Since he aimed at dealing with humble and rustic life in his poetry, he advocates the use of selection of language really used by men in a state of vivid sensation. This is important. He says that he is going to use language that is used by men in a vivid state of sensation. जब उनकी senses sharpened हैं, जब उनकी senses heightened हैं, जब उनकी senses inflamed हैं, जब उनकी senses maximum impression ले रही हैं. It's not the dull senses he is talking about here. He's not talking about the language that is used by a common man, when he's sleeping or he's lazy. Extremely heightened senses की state में, vivid, very bright impressions जो form हो रहे हैं, जो vivid है, clear है, बहुत ज़्यादा pure है. उस state में जो language इंसान use कर रहा है, common man use कर रहा है, he's going to focus on that language. He's not going to focus on any other form of language. Wordsworth believed the poet is essentially a man speaking to men. So he must use the language of real men. He is not a deity. He is not a demigod. He is not a prophet. He's just a man. And he's just a man who's talking to other men. He's just trying to deliver this poetic truth to the other man. He's just trying to deliver this universal truth to other men. He's just trying to pass on the knowledge. Why? Because he wants to give them pleasure. He wants to give them pleasure, and giving them pleasure gives him the pleasure. It's a reciprocating process. It's a man serving other men in order to serve himself. So this is the process between human beings. And if the human beings are interacting with each other, they have to speak in the language that human beings use. They have to speak in a language that human beings understand. It cannot be that exalted, it cannot be that high-sounding words which an ordinary person would find difficult to understand, which an ordinary person would read 1 page, 2 page, 3 page with the help of a dictionary, and then he would leave it off because it does not make sense to him, or he finds it a tedious job. So he says that language का question इसलिए important है क्योंकि लैंग्वेज ही तो वो टूल है जिसके जरिए आप अपनी बात आगे तक पहुंचाना चाह रहे हैं. तो आपने डिसाइड करना है कि आपने क्या पहुंचानी है बात, आपका सब्जेक्ट मैटर क्या है, उसके लिए कैसी लैंग्वेज सूटेबल है, और फिर आपने ये डिसाइड करना है कि आपका एड्रेसी कौन है, आप किससे बात कर रहे हैं, आप किसको एड्रेस कर रहे हैं, आप किस तक अपनी बात पहुंचाना चाह रहे हैं. तो 2 चीज़ें इंपॉर्टेंट हैं कि आप क्या बात पहुंचाना चाहते हैं और आप किसको बात पहुंचाना चाहते हैं. जब ये 2 चीज़ें आपने डिसाइड कर ली कि आप एक सिंपल रस्टिक एक्सपीरियंस, सिंपल रस्टिक लोगों के बारे में आम इंसान को पहुंचाना चाहते हैं. क्यों? क्योंकि आप उनको प्लेजर देना चाहते हैं, आप उनको खुशी देना चाहते हैं, आप उनको पोइटिक ट्रूथ बताना चाहते हैं, आप उनको यूनिवर्सल ट्रूथ बताना चाहते हैं. तो उसके लिए जो ज़बान इस्तेमाल होगी वो कैसी होगी? तो उसके लिए ज़बान वो इस्तेमाल होगी जो आप बोल सकते हो और जो दूसरा समझ सकता हो. हो सकता है बहुत अच्छी ज़बान बोल सकते हैं, हो सकता है आपके पास बहुत ज़्यादा वोकेबलरी हो, आपकी वोकेबलरी बहुत हाई साउंडिंग हो, बहुत अच्छी हो, रिच हो, लेकिन हो सकता है आपकी रिच वोकेबलरी उस इंसान की समझ में ना आए जिस तक ये चीज़ पहुंचनी चाहिए. सो इफ द पोएट इज़ अ मैन हु इज़ एड्रेसिंग अदर मैन, देन ही शुड यूज़ द लैंग्वेज ऑफ कॉमन मैन फॉर द सेक ऑफ हिज पोएटिक क्रिएशन. Language of prose and poetry. It's an important question. Wordsworth deliberates on it for quite a bit of time. So the new classical poets, they advocated the language of poetry was different from the language of prose, whereas Wordsworth declared that it may be safely affirmed that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition, that is verse or poetry. A new classist, I've already told you that the new classists or the Augustans, they followed the classical poets, जो Augustan age के classical poets से इनके Emperor Augustus के age, the golden age of classical poetry, उसको follow करते थे. And they believed that the language of prose was different from the language of poetry. It has to be different. उनका सारी subject matter different नहीं है, बल्कि उनकी language भी different है. जो चीज़ें prose में, जो language, जो words use हो सकते हैं, वो poetry में use नहीं हो सकते हैं. Wordsworth completely negates it. That is why we say that these 2 schools of thought, they're in complete contrast to each other. They're very different from each other. They say the opposites of things. So when they say that there has to be difference in language, Wordsworth say that there's no need to have this difference in language. There's no point in having there's a difference in language. He says that there is no essential difference. There is no and there cannot be any essential difference between the language of prose and that of metrical composition. उसको poetry भी नहीं कह रहा, वो उसको metrical composition कह रहा है. ऐसी चीज़ जिसमें आप मीटर इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, मीटर इस्तेमाल करके उसको compose कर रहे हैं verse form में. The principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents. and situations from common life to relate or describe them throughout in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time threw over them some coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. Issue क्या है? आपका सब्जेक्ट मैटर बहुत सिंपल है, आपके एजेंट्स भी बहुत सिंपल हैं, तो आपने ये सिंपल एजेंट्स और सिंपल सब्जेक्ट मैटर को कॉमन इंसान तक पहुंचाना है, तो उसके लिए आप ऐसी लैंग्वेज इस्तेमाल करते हैं जो कि उस कॉमन से सब्जेक्ट को, उस आम सी बात को, उस आम से कैरेक्टर के ऊपर थोड़ी सी इमेजिनेटिव लाइट डाले, उसको थोड़ा सा कलरफुल कर दे, उसको थोड़ा सा रियलिटी से ज़्यादा इन्हांस कर दे, उसकी खूबसूरती को इन्हांस कर दे, उसके अंदर थोड़े से कलर्स ऐड कर, उसको ब्राइट कर दे, उसको अट्रैक्टिव बना दे। तो वो लैंग्वेज कौन सी होगी? वो लैंग्वेज बहुत ही हाई साउंडिंग स्कॉलरली लैंग्वेज नहीं हो सकती, बट इट हैज़ टू बी द लैंग्वेज ऑफ अ कॉमन मैन, बिकॉज ही इज गोइंग टू आइडेंटिफाई विद दैट लैंग्वेज ओनली. He cannot identify with the language of the person who just sits in his library and reads thousands of books every day. It has to be the language of a person who lives close to the nature, who lives the rustic life, who experiences all these things, who leads a life. It's not a person, living in sitting behind a desk or living in a mansion. These people cannot understand what this poet is talking about in this poem. And above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of our nature, chiefly as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. You have to focus कि वो लैंग्वेज ऐसी हो कि आप अपने कि उसके अंदर वो सिचुएशंस और वो इंसिडेंट्स जो हैं वो आप प्रेजेंट कर सकें हों, ठीक है? उस लैंग्वेज में वो एबिलिटी हो कि वो इंसिडेंट्स और उन सिचुएशंस को अच्छी तरह प्रेजेंट कर सकती हो, उसको अच्छी तरह डिपिक्ट कर सकती हो. लेकिन उसके साथ साथ जो एक रूल है जिसको आप फॉलो कर रहे हैं कि आइडियाज़ और इमोशंस का, कि सर्टन आइडियाज़ एंड इमोशंस, हाउ दे केप्ट टुगेदर, हाउ देयर इज अ बैलेंस बिटवीन देम, द लैंग्वेज हैज़ टू मेंटेन दैट बैलेंस एज वेल, द बैलेंस बिटवीन इमोशन एंड आइडिया, एंड द बैलेंस बिटवीन द प्लेजर दैट इज प्रोड्यूस्ड एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ दीज इमोशंस एंड आइडियाज़. You have to keep a balance. The language has to be such that it has this balance. It helps achieve that balance. It helps achieve that state of excitement without it being out of the boundaries. It helps achieve that state of excitement, that state of pleasure without violating or all the restraints. The language too of these men have been adopted because such men communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is derived. Why is language so important? Why should their language be used? Why should the language of the rustic man should be used? What is the reason behind it? Why? Because these people, they deal with the best that the world has to offer. These people, the common man, the rustic man, the man living in the village, he deals with nature. Nature is the best thing the universe has to offer to man. So when they deal with the best, of course they have the language that is the best. Their language has to be the best because it deals with the best of the elements. So जो चीज़ इतनी अच्छी चीज़ से राइज करेगी, इतनी अच्छी चीज़ में जिसका ओरिजिन होगा, it cannot be wrong, it cannot be decadent, it cannot be degenerated, it should not be degraded, it should not be disregarded, it has to be the best of the best. Wordsworth was a competent critic. Why is he a competent critic? Because Wordsworth believed that a competent critic is one who experiments and is mature and who does not appreciate poetry in a fit of excitement. अच्छा, अब Wordsworth ने इसके बाद आपको बताया है कि पहले तो उसने आपको सारा बैकग्राउंड दे दिया ना कि उसने क्या, उसकी प्रीफेस में क्या चीज़ लिखी. उसके बाद उसने कहा कि I know people are going to judge my poetry. They're going to have this critical appreciation of my poetry. People are going to write about it. So he says कि I believe that there has to be certain competency about critic. What is that competency be? What should be the standard that we should look for in a critic? What kind of a person a critic should be? He believes that a competent critic is the one who experiments. ठीक है? It's not the one who's a traditionalist. He does not believe in a traditionalist critic. He does not believe कि वो ऐसा बंदा हो जो लकीर का फ़कीर हो, जो कह रहा हो कि जब पोइट्री लिखी ही 3 स्टेंजेस में जाती है तो वो हमेशा 3 स्टेंजेस में ही होनी चाहिए, बल्कि क्रिटिक हैज़ टू बी अ पर्सन हु एप्रिशिएट्स समथिंग डिफरेंट. A critic has to be a person who appreciates something original. So it's a part of being a mature critic, a competent critic, that he has to be experimental. He has to appreciate people who experiment. He has to appreciate people who dare deviate from the normal, who dare do something different. So if he does not do that, if he is, all judgmental about things, if he is all, being looking down upon things that are different, if he's being, rude about people who are different from the, the common crowd, or who dare to be different from what has already been done by the predecessors, या जो रिवाज चल रहा हो या जो तरीका चल रहा हो उस वक़्त, अगर वो उससे डिफरेंट हैं और वो जो क्रिटिक है वो उसको जज करता है, उसको लुक डाउन अपॉन करता है, then that critic according to Wordsworth would not be a competent critic, would not be mature enough. He has to be mature as well. Mature का क्या मतलब है? उसका intellect mature होना चाहिए. He should have the ability to analyze. He should have the ability to think differently. कॉमनली तो सब लोग सोच रहे हैं ना कि चीज़ों को इस तरह होना चाहिए, लेकिन अगर किसी ने कुछ डिफरेंट लिखा है तो उसका एनालिसिस करने की एबिलिटी होनी चाहिए उस क्रिटिक के अंदर. उसके अंदर जो डिफरेंट चीज़ है उसको पॉइंट आउट करने की एबिलिटी भी होनी चाहिए, उसको असर्टेन करने की, उसको जज करने की एबिलिटी उस पोइट के अंदर होनी चाहिए. ही शुड नॉट बी अ पर्सन हु इज़ very impulsive. He should not be a person who's shallow. He should not be a person who's superficial. He has to be deep. And who does not appreciate poetry in a fit of excitement? Do not appreciate poetry in a fit of excitement just because he read something and it sounded good, just because it sounded as if it deals with something important, just because it created some sort of emotions in him, or just because it heightened his state of excitement. Just because of that, he is not supposed to appreciate poetry. He's not supposed to judge poetry when he's in that state of excitement. He's not supposed to get affected by it. He's supposed to keep a calm and contained demeanor. He's supposed to be aloof. He's supposed to detach his feelings from the literary merits of the work he's trying to judge. Of course, he has to judge the fact whether the poetry has has any real depth. He has to judge the fact whether it is achieving its final end, whether it's providing pleasure or something. Of course, he would be affected. He's a human being. He has emotions. He has a logical process going on in him. He will be affected by if the poetry is good and something, but he has to avoid the state of excitement. He has to stay away from the state of excitement. He cannot let it rule his judgment. He should have a taste for poetry and shouldn't neglect it. उसने अपना एक टेस्ट बनाया. टेस्ट कैसे बनता है? टेस्ट बनता है when you keep on reading something for a longer period of time, when you keep on आप बचपन से पढ़ रहे हैं एक चीज़, आपने उसको कल्टिवेट किया है, आपने उस पर मेहनत की है. टेस्ट एक्वायर होता है when you work very hard on something. ब्लैक कॉफ़ी है, उसका टेस्ट एक्वायर करना पड़ता है. एक्वायर कैसे होता है? आप बार बार पी के देखते हैं, एक्सपेरिमेंट करते हैं. कभी 1/4 चम्मच कॉफ़ी का डालते हैं पानी के अंदर, कभी पानी ऊपर से डाल के देखते हैं, कभी कॉफ़ी बीट करके अंदर पानी डाल के देखते हैं, कभी आधा चम्मच करते हैं, फिर उसके अंदर चीनी डालते हैं. आहिस्ता आहिस्ता करते करते यू गेट द टेस्ट ऑफ इट. आप अप्रिशिएट करना शुरू हो जाते हैं. पहले आप नेस्कैफे की कॉफ़ी पीना शुरू करते हैं, आहिस्ता आहिस्ता आप ब्राज़ीलियन बीन्स पे जाना शुरू कर देते हैं, फिर आप अपनी कॉफ़ी खुद ब्रू करना शुरू कर देते हैं. एक ग्रेजुअल प्रोसेस है जिससे आप गुजरते हैं और उसके बाद आप एक खास टेस्ट एक्वायर करते हैं. सो अ पर्सन हु इज अ गुड क्रिटिक ऑफ पोइट्री वुड हैव टू गो थ्रू अ प्रोसेस. ही हैज टू एक्वायर द टेस्ट ऑफ गुड पोइट्री. He has to work hard on it. He could not neglect it. He could not, just one day get up and decide that he's going to read poetry and he's going to be a critic of poetry. It has to be a lifelong process. It has to be cultivated. It has to be worked hard upon. It has to be done like a chore. It has to be done. It's not something that would come to you naturally. Of course, you'll have some sort of instinct of good poetry. Of course, you will understand poetry. You'll appreciate it. लेकिन जो taste acquire करना है या critic बनने के लिए जो taste चाहिए है या जो ability चाहिए है, उसके लिए you have to work hard. He should not read poetry merely to escape from the fret and fever of the world. It should not be an escape for him. Poetry is there to provide pleasure. Poetry is there to provide an escape. but for the sake of for being a critic, it's important that it's not an escape for you. For being a critic, it is important that you analyze it for what it is. You should not be, all lost in its beauty and its the escape it offers you. You have to analyze. You have to keep a detached mind. You have to keep yourself separate from your emotions and look at it objectively. For the critic, it is important to look at the piece of poetry or piece of literature objectively, not letting his emotions or his biases or his prejudices affect or his troubles or his state of mind affect his judgment. He should not be beguiled by his youth and emotions when appreciating a poem. So it means that he has not to be, it's necessary that he's not young, because when I read poetry, and poems that I used to like when I was 21 years old, and I've written them in my diaries, and I read them again now after so many years, I look at them and I'd say, what? Why did I even like it? Because the youth has a different thought process. Youth has different emotional states. Youth is basically beguiling your senses. It either heightens it or it numbs down a few senses. So if a critic is youthful, his emotions, his passion, his way of looking at life, and his inexperience, it's not a good state to be a critic. Youth is going to misguide you. It's going to mislead you. So it's better not to be very youthful and not to be very emotional when you're trying to appreciate a poem. He should continue to read poetry even after he has advanced in years in order to properly train and discipline his sensibilities. इसके लिए कोई एज लिमिट नहीं होनी चाहिए कि जी आप सिर्फ जवानी में पोइट्री पढ़ते थे because you had to woo some girl or you enjoyed it or you liked reading poetry or when you were a student. You should continue reading it. Why? Because it evolves. Poetry evolves, so does your senses evolve. Your experience, you add in your experience, you add in your personality and you evolve as a person. So जो आपकी evolution है वो आपकी ability to understand poetry and your ability to judge poetry will be affect करती है. So a critic has to be an avid reader. He had to be a continuous reader. He has to be involved in the process of writing and reading poetry throughout his life. It's not कि वो सिर्फ youth में पढ़ता रहा हो या जब वो mature हो तब पढ़ता रहा हो या वो उसको escape के लिए पढ़ता हो. It has to be a continuous process. He should be free from prejudices. He should not belong to a certain literary group or follow a certain literary movement. He has to be an impartial judge. He does not have to have a prejudice. Just because he's a Pakistani poet or Pakistani critic, he would not like someone who's an Indian poet or an Indian novelist. He has to rise above these things. Okay? He would not, let's say, if someone has written about something against Muslims, you're not going to judge it because he has written something against the Muslims. But a good critic would rise above his religion, would rise above his nationality, would rise above his gender for that matter, and would rise above his ethnicity, everything, race, creed. He would not think about these things. वो अपनी political inclinations के बारे में नहीं सोचेगा, वो अपनी philosophical inclinations के बारे में नहीं सोचेगा, वो अपनी physical preferences के बारे में नहीं सोचेगा. He has to be away from all these things. He has to keep himself separate from all these things. Only then and then he would be a competent critic. So there's so many things according to Wordsworth involved in, the criteria he has for a good critic or a competent critic is a little too harsh. It's a little too much to ask. The appropriate business of poetry is to treat things not as they are, but as they appear, not as they exist in themselves, but as they seem to exist in the senses and the passions. Poetry does not deal with something that appears to be. It's something more than it appears to be. It's something that you perceive. ये जो पिकासो कहता होता है ना कि आप पिकासो से किसी ने कहा कि इस घोड़े की तस्वीर बनाओ, जब उसने घोड़े की तस्वीर बनाई तो उसमें तो कुछ भी नज़र नहीं आ रहा था. पिकासो से पूछा बंदे ने कि ये तुमने घोड़े की तस्वीर बनाई, ये तो घोड़ा नहीं लग रहा. कहता है मुझे तो घोड़ा ऐसे ही दिखता है. ठीक है. There is a very famous picture by him. जब उसे किसी ने कहा कि you have to paint these flowers in a vase, ठीक है, और उसने जो flowers बनाए उस vase में, तो there was this vase और उसमें से टहनियाँ निकली, उन टहनियों के ऊपर आंखें हैं बहुत सारी. So that's how he perceives. Poetry is the same kind of thing. It's the business of treating things not as they are, but as they appear to be. To whom it appears to be? To the poet. जैसे वो उसको नज़र आ रही है, जैसे वो उनको perceive कर रहा है, जैसे वो उसको sense कर रहा है, जैसे वो उसकी sensibilities को affect कर रही हैं, जैसे वो उसकी emotions को affect कर रही हैं. It would be a haze of his sensibility and his emotions on those things. It has to be colored by his imagination, tinted by his fancy. Therefore, those who are inexperienced and lack of maturity can be deluded by their own passions. Okay? That is why it is important. That is why it is important for the person writing poetry to be mature enough. It has nothing to do with age. It has everything to do with maturity. Keats died when he was 26 or 29. He was very young when he died. So when a person died so young, was he mature enough? Yes, he was. When you read whatever he has to say, it's phenomenal. So age has nothing to do with, maturity has everything to do with it. If you're not mature enough, you'll be deluded by your passions. Aapki passions can lead you astray. Aapki feelings can lead you astray. They can take you to another field. They can make you move in a direction which is not appropriate enough. So it's the passions that have to be mature enough. You should be mature enough to control those passions. You should be mature enough to control that state of excitement. A juvenile reader will not have any imprint of good advice and will try to justify the extravagance and sanction absurdity. You have to keep in mind what kind of person would be reading your poetry. If it's a juvenile reader, if it's an immature reader, if it's an underage reader, he's not going to get something good out of it. So you have to keep in mind what you write, because the person who's reading it would ascertain or would get or would extract what he or she wants to extract from it according to his maturity. So you have to be very cautious when you're writing poetry. Wordsworth therefore drives those who are young to regulate their own sensibility and bring in a more discreet and sound judgment before they become a critic. So if you want to become a critic, if you are young, then you have to evolve a little. It means that you have to control your sensibilities. You have to become mature enough. You have to be discreet. You have to have a sound judgment. You have to let your emotions be separate from your judgment. You have to let your mind control your judgment. You have to be logical. आपका intellect आपकी judgment को control करेगा, आपका emotions आपकी judgment को control ना करें. So that is why he says if you're young, you have to have these abilities in you. When you have these abilities in you, only then you'd be able to be a good critic. Only then you'd be able to judge things as they are. Men of advanced age. ये नहीं कि अगर सिर्फ youths वाले जो लोग हैं, young जो लोग हैं, वो critics अच्छे नहीं बन सकते. But he believes कि men of age, people who are, you know, quite middle-aged or old-aged, they are also not competent critics. Why? Because they are they may be men of experience with practical sense of the world, but they can also be deluded by a new volume of poem. कैसे जी? If you are a mature person, ठीक है, you're a man of world, आपने job भी की है, इतने साल आपका इतना experience है, आपने ज़िंदगी गुजारी है, you have dealt with so many stages of life, you have passed through them, you're different than a youth. लेकिन फिर भी एक नई पोएम्स की कलेक्शन आई है बाज़ार में, आप उससे अफेक्ट हो जाते हैं. क्यों हो जाते हैं? कि they're still immature in your judgment. You're still immature because you're affected by the emotions that volume of poetry is going to cause in you. It might bring you back. It might take you back to your youth. It might evoke in you certain feelings which you experienced when you were young enough. They're still immature in their judgment. If a new poem falls in the way, they're just dazzled and they go back to their own youthful days. आपको nostalgia भी हो सकता है, and that nostalgia, of course, it means you're impassioned. You're not thinking clearly. It means that you're not being impartial. You're being prejudiced. Your feelings for the past, your feelings for the life that you have led are affecting your judgment here. The book may prove to be an escape as well. आप अपनी प्रेजेंट लाइफ से खुश नहीं हैं, आपको योर लाइफ डिडंट टर्न आउट टू बी व्हाट यू एक्सपेक्टेड इट टू बी, और यू गोइंग थ्रू अ मिड लाइफ क्राइसिस, that volume of poetry can be an escape for you. You can keep on thinking that yes, life has a little more to offer. You can get influenced by it because it is offering you the escape that you needed badly from the life that you were leading. They may look like the book, but that would not be a sign of a mature critic. They would like it because it is offering them an escape. It is taking them back to the time of their life where they were happy, where they were impassionate, and where they were all ecstatic about what was going to happen. So जो चीज़ उनको वहाँ लेके जा रही है वो उससे इम्प्रेस ही होंगे ना, लेकिन चूंकि वो उससे इम्प्रेस हो रहे हैं किसी गलत वजह की वजह से, इसलिए वो भी अच्छे क्रिटिक नहीं बन सकते. Even the men of age, for want of practice, are beguiled into admiration of artificial diction. They cannot be moved by beauty of pure style. Very few people appreciate the subtlety. Very few people appreciate the simplicity. You know, most of the people, they like things that are all bright and shiny and gaudy, and they attract you, ठीक है? Peacock blue and green, they attract you towards themselves. Red attracts you towards themselves. Something that is white and something that has a white. Let's talk about a dress for that matter. If you have this beige dress जिसके ऊपर beige ही कढ़ाई हुई है और beige ही रंग की कोई लेस भी लगी हुई है, simple लग रहा है, subtle लग रहा है, but there is style in it. There's a beautiful cut to it. People generally would not appreciate that. People would appreciate let's say a red and a black dress, ठीक है, जिस पे एक बड़ा सा फूल यहाँ लगा हुआ है, ये जिस पे बहुत सारी एम्ब्रॉयडरी हुई हुई है, ये जिस पे गोटा लगा हुआ है, लोग उससे ज़्यादा अट्रैक्ट होंगे, ठीक है. So he says just because you're mature doesn't mean that you would be able to appreciate the beauty of style, ठीक है. You can also get impressed by this powerful diction that poets use, artificial diction जो use होती है. वो लैंग्वेज ऑफ पोइट्री जिसके बारे में वर्ड्सवर्थ अब तक बात करता आया है कि द लैंग्वेज ऑफ पोइट्री दैट वाज ओरिजिनल, द लैंग्वेज ऑफ पोइट्री दैट वुड अट्रैक्ट यू, द लैंग्वेज ऑफ पोइट्री दैट वुड कम नेचुरली विद द पावरफुल फीलिंग्स, दैट इज नेचुरल. बट कुछ एक चीज़ होती है जो आर्टिफिशियल डिक्शन है, जिसके वर्ड्सवर्थ अगेंस्ट है. तो वो आर्टिफिशियल डिक्शन जो है वो अट्रैक्टिव होगी लोगों के लिए. They cannot be moved by beauty of pure style. They would be attracted to the artificial diction. An enlightened critic कैसा होगा, ठीक है? Enlightened critic would look for the wisdom of heart and grandeur of imagination. A good critic would be able to find these two things. He would find the wisdom of the heart. He would look for the powerful emotions. He would look for the imagination, the play of imagination, the flight of fancy. Whenever these appear, simplicity and magnificence accompany them. जहाँ ये होंगी दो चीज़ें, जहाँ पे सच्चाई होगी, जहाँ पे ओरिजिनलिटी होगी, वहाँ you don't need ornaments. There you do not need artificial stuff. If you're beautiful, you do not need makeup. वो जिसे क्या कहते हैं, नहीं मोहताज जेवर का जिसे खूबी खुदा ने दी, ये वही बात है कि if you are beautiful, you do not need this all makeup and jewelry and beautiful dresses. You look beautiful as you are. So if the feeling is pure, the poetry is from the heart, then you do not need this artificial diction. You do not need all these beautiful words, and you do not need the powerful subjects about subject matters and strong characters. The truth of the feeling would be appreciated only by a true critic. They'll be able to appreciate the simplicity and the magnificence that truth has, the simplicity has. But those who are used to artificial diction, they fail to realize this dictum. Such a critic is rather repelled by higher poetry than is attracted by it. If you're an artificial, if you're not a competent critic, then you are going to be appalled by the simple language, the higher poetry, which Wordsworth calls it, the simpler poetry, the poetry that deals with magnificence, that deals with the wisdom of heart. You're not going to like it because it's too simple. You'll be appalled by it. You won't like high poetry. You'd be repelled by it if you're not a competent critic then. that's about all that Wordsworth had to say about the preface to the lyrical ballad. So let's sum up the preface and get a gist of whatever he had said so far in the preface to the lyrical ballad. So we know for a fact कि ये जो preface था lyrical ballad का, it was this the need for it arises when Wordsworth moves away from the classist criticism. ठीक है, classical critics जो थे, they believed कि things have to be done in a certain way. There are certain rules that are set, there are certain principles that are to be followed, and the principles and the rules were that the subject matter was to be from the higher strata of society. It has to be a philosophical question that has to be answered. If it treats with the harsh realities of life, कुछ भी होगा तो बहुत high sounding होगा. ठीक है? They believed in particular poetical diction, and they believed that certain things have to be followed. जो romantics थे, वो क्लासेस से बिल्कुल डिफरेंट थे. और वो कैसे डिफरेंट थे? They believed कि anything can be the subject matter of poetry, any man can be the subject matter of poetry, and they believed in feelings and they believed in emotions. जो classes थे, they didn't believe in any emotion, they didn't believe in any feeling. They said that these things have to be separate from poetry. If there has to be something said, it has to be said in an objective way. There has to be no room for feelings or emotions or imagination. Romantics इसके बिल्कुल opposite थे, and they said that poetry has to be subjective. It has to be based on the interpretations of feelings and emotions and imagination and fancy. People have to interpret a piece of poetry according to their own minds, according to their own feelings. They said that the essence of poetry was imagination. Feelings and emotions was everything. So for this purpose that this movement started, one of the pioneers was William Wordsworth, and he wrote this lyrical ballads. It's a collection of poems that he has written. When he wrote this collection of poems, he wrote a preface to it as well. So when he wrote this preface, people asked that why he has written this preface. He explained in the preface the reason for writing this essay. He says that I'm writing this essay or this preface just before the collection of my poems in order to explain to you why I have deviated, why I have moved away from my predecessors, why am I not following the Augustans, why am I not following the new classicals, why am I doing something different. He says that I'm doing something different. And what is something different? That something different is that he's going to write a different kind of poetry, and he says that I'm going to explain to you what is my definition of poetry, what is according to me is the nature of poetry, what according to me is the function of poetry, what according to me is the end of poetry. I will also tell you what I think a poet should be, what I think should be the purpose of poetry, and what I think should be the role of poet in a society. I'm going to give answer to all these things so that I can justify my moving away from the mainstream. अच्छा, फिर ये mainstream तो ये खुद ही से बाद में बन जाती है, ठीक है? अच्छा, सबसे पहले वो डिस्कस करता है उसकी definition of poetry क्या थी. उसने poetry की definition दी है कि poetry is going to be a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. It would be something that would produce in you, that would give rise into you. It would come to you automatically. It would come to you, it would flow out of you. It would flow out of you, and then you're going to be overwhelmed by these feelings. But then there would come a state of tranquility, and you could recollect those feelings in that in the state of tranquility, and then poem would be produced. Uska process of poetry creation hai pura. It's not as simple as, you know, getting up one day, putting a pen to the paper and writing a poem. He says that poetry has its origin, and it originates from a notable experience. You observe something. When you observe something, it creates some sort of feelings in you. You contemplate those feelings. You contemplate long and deep, and when you contemplate those feelings, then you move from them, and then you move towards the next process, which is a recollection of these feelings in the state of tranquility, and then a poem is produced. Wordsworth has described the theory of poetry and his conception of the function of poet. In his theory of poetry, he set down the origin, the nature, and the purpose of poetry, and the function of poet in the civil society. He is not being vague, he's being very precise, he's addressing every question that might arise as a result of his moving away from the what's regularly considered as poetry. Wordsworth defines poetry as a spontaneous spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origins from the emotions recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till the tranquility disappears. And as a result, when the tranquility disappears and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in mind. जो feelings आपके पास उस tranquility के बाद रह जाएंगी, वो feelings आपकी original feelings होंगी, वो feelings आपकी purified feelings होंगी, और वो purified feelings they're going to originate poetry. They're going to result in the poetic creation. The poetic process is a long process. It's not as easy. It's not something, because that is why he says that you can't call the poet a simple ordinary, it's not an ordinary job. It's an exalted post that you have to provide pleasure, and to provide pleasure you have to do so much. Poetry is an overflow of powerful emotions, which involves a reconciliation of opposite powerful emotions and profound thoughts. It's not something that comes to you naturally. You have to work hard on it. You have to realize what you're feeling. You have to analyze your thoughts. There's going to be a state of excitement. There are going to be certain ideas. The two things, they're going to follow each other. They could be haphazard unless and until you control them. When you control them, you can distinguish between your ideas and your emotions, and there comes a state when they are, both these things are in a perfect harmony, when they're in a perfect balance, and in that state you create poetry. The sequence of events described in the preface for the production of poetry is, number one, a notable experience, something that you observe and something that has an impact on you. As a result of that notable experience, you have this deep and long contemplation. That is, a long period passes. आपने कोई चीज़ observe की, वो चीज़ आपकी एक image आपका दिमाग में form हुआ, you collect that image. And it's not कि you automatically start reciting poetry. आप poetry की आमद नहीं फौरन शुरू हो जाती, बल्कि you collect that image and you keep on contemplating it. After a period of few years, a period of tranquility, there's a sudden overflow of powerful feelings when you recollect that impression that has formed in your mind. Pleasure in the poet's pleasurable emotion as the experience is recaptured. Is pleasure when you recapture that emotion, when you recapture that feelings of pleasure. And recreated shaping of the poem, hardly touched on in the preface, except as a transition in the pleasure of the poet, pleasure for the reader. The threefold pleasure here: pleasure for the reader, pleasure for the poet when he's creating the poem, and pleasure for the poet when the reader reads the poem and gets pleasure. Wordsworth ने दोबारा poetry को define भी किया. He says that it's a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. This refers to the nature of the poetry, what he thinks poetry is. Poetry is a feeling, is a matter of feeling and mood. It flows from the internal feelings of the poet. It surroundings do instigate it, they are the inspiration, लेकिन अंदर से हमेशा निकलेगी, वो आपके heart से निकलेगी. When the poet is in the poetic mood, he sings out rapture or sorrows spontaneously from the core of his heart. It comes from the very core of the heart, whether it's sorrow or is it happiness. If he's singing a song, it would come from the core of the heart. If he's being sorrowful and if he's shedding tears, or if he's being, all cathartic about it, it's going to come from the heart. In a poetic mood, poetry flows out naturally from a poet's heart. In such moments, his language of discourse becomes the language of poetical inspiration. जो उस वक़्त जब वो poetry उसके अंदर से निकल रही है, जब वो इमोशन प्रोड्यूस हो रहे हैं, तो जो लैंग्वेज है उसकी वो पोइटिकल इंस्पिरेशन की लैंग्वेज है, पोइटिकल कॉम्पोजिशन की लैंग्वेज है. इट कम्स नेचुरली. द पॉइंट हियर इज दैट इट कम्स नेचुरली. इट्स नॉट समथिंग दैट यू कैन फोर्स आउट ऑफ योरसेल्फ. इट्स नॉट समथिंग दैट यू हैव टू फेक. It's not something that you have to work at. It comes naturally to you. The language, it comes naturally to you because of the feelings that comes out of the heart. Poetry cannot be composed under duress. It cannot be composed under such stress. It cannot be composed under certain restrictions. The clear spring of poetry must flow freely and spontaneously. it cannot be made to flow through artificially laid pipes. यानी कि आप कुछ खास किस्म की डिक्शन क्रिएट नहीं कर सकते, आप कुछ खास किस्म की रिस्ट्रिक्शंस नहीं लगा सकते कि इसी में पोइट्री हो सकती है. It comes naturally, it flows naturally. It's a clear spring, it's a pure spring. एक खास चश्मा है पानी का. It's a river, it's going to take its own course. It's going to define what it's going to be like. It's going to define its form. It's going to define its form based on the subject matter it has, based on the emotion it is derived from. It's an expression of powerful feelings. These feelings are felt in the heart and they're not generated in the mind. It is different. Heart की feelings और mind की intellect में difference है. और poet जो Wordsworth है वो कहता है कि poetry जब भी create होगी तो वो heart में create होगी. Poetry takes its birth in the springs of the heart and not in the cool store of the mind. He calls the mind a cold store. He says कि mind जो है वो intellect का घर है. It's cool and it's logical. Heart is warm and emotional and compassionate. Poetry is born not in the mind but in the heart overflowing with emotions. Mind is the storehouse of intellect and logic and reason. Heart is the store, it's a spring. उबलने का जैसे चश्मे ना, वो चश्मा उबलता है, इस तरह हार्ट को भी उसने एज a spring इसलिए कहा है because the emotions they just flow out, they spring out. All of us feel, so does the poet, but he feels intensely. मैं भी feel कर रही हूँ, आप भी feel कर रहे हैं. We all have these senses, but the sensibility of the poet or the intensity of his feelings would be different, would be greater than ours. The poet's heart leap up when he beholds the rainbow. It would leap up, it would leap out of his chest for that matter. He would be so excited in seeing the rainbow. The heightened emotional state of the poet finds expression through two verses. Thus, according to Wordsworth, deep emotion is the fundamental condition of poetry. It is the feeling that matters. Feelings है जो base पे होगी. It's a feeling है जो उसको powerful emotions को बनाएंगे. ये powerful emotions हैं, ये poetry की form इख्तियार कर लेंगे. It's the feeling that matters. If you have the right amount of feeling, if you have the right kind of feeling, it's going to give rise to poetry. He discards the Aristotle doctrine where he says that plot is the most important thing. It's the first and the most important thing. He believes that feelings therein developed gives importance to the action and situation. It's the feeling that is important. If the feeling, the right kind of feeling, the right kind of emotion is there, it's going to give rise to action and situation. वो खुद ही action create कर लेगा, वो खुद ही situation create कर लेगा. Mythos जो होता है, जो plot होता है, वो action और situation ही भी तो base कर रहा होता है. एरिस्टोटल तो कहता है कि एक्शन और सिचुएशन जो है वो सबसे इम्पॉर्टेंट है. वर्ड्सवर्थ कहता है कि फीलिंग सबसे ज़्यादा इम्पॉर्टेंट है. व्हेन यू हैव द राइट अमाउंट ऑफ फीलिंग, राइट काइंड ऑफ फीलिंग, पावरफुल इनफ, स्पॉन्टेनियस इनफ, then they're going to create their own action and they're going to create their own situation. Wordsworth told that a poet must be a man possessed of more than usual organic sensibility. हमने organic sensibility की बात की थी कि a poet is going to be a person who would have organic sensibility and who would be the person who would think long and deep. Organic sensibility, we all have organic sensibility. We have these senses. In the case of ordinary men, it is overpowered by the weight of custom. ठीक है, हमारे जो 5 सेंसेस हैं, ये जो हमारे सोचने का तरीका है, ये जो हमारे परसीव करने का तरीका है, इट इज़ कंट्रोल्ड बाय आवर कस्टम. हमारे रस्म और रिवाज उसको कंट्रोल करते हैं. इन द केस ऑफ पोएट इट्स नॉट सो. ही ऑगमेंट्स इट, ही एड्स टू इट, ही कंट्रोल्स इट बाय हिज हार्ट. That is not all Wordsworth has in mind. His poet is not simply a man of feeling. Feelings, of course, he must have, since poetry is in fact the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and arise from the emotion recollected in tranquility. जो उसका poet है, उसकी सिर्फ feelings नहीं होंगी, बल्कि उसकी जो sensibilities होंगी, organic sensibilities होंगी, he would have them more than usual. He would have it a little more sharper than the common man. But before the emotions can come to the senses, before the emotion come the senses, and it is not of them that Wordsworth is thinking when he adds the epithet organic. जो आपकी senses हैं, वो आपके emotions से पहले आती हैं, because आपकी senses हैं तो वो कोई चीज़ perceive करती हैं. जब वो कोई चीज़ perceive करती हैं तो उस चीज़ का image आपके दिमाग पे डालती हैं. That image then give rise to the emotions. Organic sensibility then means or implies the capacity or to receive impression through senses. your five senses that you have, your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of hearing and sight and taste and smell, all these things, they give you the impression of the things around you. The emotion which accompanies the original impression revives when the impression is recalled. जो notable experience था उसके result में जो impression form हुआ, वो impression ने it gave rise to certain feelings. When the impression is recalled, it gives rise to, you recollect the feelings that were arisen the first time. The ability thus to reconstruct an emotion belongs in an eminent degree to the poet, being in fact a portion of his native endowment more than usual organic sensibility. If you have the sharper senses, only then you'll be able to retain a sharper image. जब वो इमेज जितना ज़्यादा शार्प होगा, जितना ज़्यादा विविड होगा रिकलेक्शन के वक्त, उतनी ही ज़्यादा वो फीलिंग्स वापस आएंगी जो उसके पहली दफ़ा परसीव करने पे आपके अंदर पैदा हुई थी. तो जब वो फीलिंग्स वापस आएंगी तो रिकलेक्शन में तभी आपके अंदर दोबारा वो पावरफुल इमोशंस पैदा होंगे एंड यू विल बी एबल टू क्रिएट पोइट्री. So emotions, they have to be recollected in tranquility. He observed that observation and senses and the powerful emotions, they're not enough. He believes that there has to be a third element as well. It has to be, the feelings, they have to be guarded by a controlled mind. They have to be tracked in a proper direction. He explains the role of calm thinking and deliberate contemplation in the composition of poetry later in the preface when he says, the emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. आपका दिमाग क्या करता है कि आपकी सेंसेस ने एक इम्प्रेशन बनाया. जब वो इम्प्रेशन आपने रिकलेक्ट किया तो आपके दिल में कुछ इमोशंस पैदा हुए. अब वो सेंसेस ने जो इमेज बनाया और जो इमोशंस पैदा हुए वो दोनों में एक दूसरे के साथ मिंगल हो रहे हैं. Your mind is going to purge the emotions. It's going to identify the emotions that were important enough to be present at this point still. It's going to remove the emotions from the impressions and it's going to make an emotion out of it which would then create poetry. उसको इमोशन से डिटैच करके आप उसको एनालिसिस कर सकते हैं. ये इमोशन से डिटैच करने का काम आपका माइंड करता है जो ट्रैंक्विलिटी में काम कर सकता है, स्टेट ऑफ रिलैक्सेशन में काम करेगा. इन दिस मूड सक्सेसफुल कॉम्पोजिशन जनरली बिगिंस. जब इस स्टेट में आप आ जाते हैं कि आप काम हैं, कलेक्टेड हैं, लॉजिकल हैं, रीजनेबल हैं, आपने जो प्रोसेस ऑफ इमोशन था, प्रोसेस ऑफ इम्प्रेशन था, वो सब कंप्लीट कर लिया है. अब वो प्रोसेस ऑफ इमोशन और सेंसेस को मिला के आपका दिमाग जो है एक ऐसी स्टेट में पहुंच गया है कि जब वो इन दोनों चीज़ों के अंदर से बेस्ट चीज़ों को निकाल के प्रोसेस ऑफ क्रिएशन स्टार्ट कर सकता है. फिर वो प्रोसेस ऑफ कॉम्पोजिशन स्टार्ट होता है. इट हैज़ टू दिस स्टेट, इट हैज़ टू कैरी आउट, इट हैज़ टू कंटिन्यू थ्रू द entire process of creation. The process of poetic composition is not an easy one, evidently. Wordsworth has mentioned 6 causes that lead to poetic composition and we have discussed them as observation and description, sensibility, reflections, imagination and fancy, invention and judgment. The function of poetry, we have discussed that the function of poetry was Wordsworth lay emphasis that good poetry is never an immediate reaction to the provoking cause, that our sensation must be allowed time to back into the common fluent of experience, there to find the level and due proportion. When you see something beautiful, you do not automatically start reciting poetry. You need time to analyze it. And good poetry would only be created when your emotions are given time to stabilize, when your emotions are given time to get normal. And then and only then they can find what emotion was strong enough, what emotion was important enough to persist. And then वो अपने सही लेवल पे आएगा, सही proportion gain करेगा and then you'll be able to create poetry. That level is found for them by the mind in the act of contemplation. ठीक है, वो लेवल कैसे अचीव होता है, वो कैसे काम डाउन होते हैं, वो कैसे न्यूट्रल होते हैं, वो कैसे स्टेबल होते हैं, ये तब होते हैं जब आपका दिमाग जो है उनको स्टेट ऑफ ट्रैंक्विलिटी में लेके जाता है. जो तीसरा फंक्शन है ना वो दिमाग का है. पहले सेंसेस हैं, फिर इमोशंस हैं एंड फिर योर माइंड इज गोइंग टू वर्क एंड योर माइंड इज गोइंग टू मेक देम स्टेबल. the sensations revive, and out of the union of the contemplation of mind and the receiving sensibility rises a unique mood of expression which we call poetry. Your senses and your mind, they combine together, they create something, and that something is called, when expressed properly, is called poetry. Wordsworth says that poetry is the breath and finer spirits of all knowledge, the impassioned expression that is the countenance of all science. He finds it to be the highest of art form. It encompasses everything, every kind of truth, every universal truth. It's the breath and the finer spirit of knowledge. Every kind of knowledge is present in poetry. It tells you everything that you need to know in order to live a life. Wordsworth felt strongly that there was no worthy pursuit but the idea of doing some good for the world. And doing something good would be by writing poetry, because by writing poetry you're not going to only provide pleasure, but you're also going to provide knowledge to the people, the universal truths. He hoped that his poems would separate in them degree to extend the domain of sensibility for the delight, the honor, and the benefit of human nature. So he says that he's going to write poetry because he wants to honor the human race, he wants to delight the human race, and he wants to benefit the human race. So that is about all we have from Wordsworth. The next thing we're going to study is S.T. Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's one of the friends of William Wordsworth, and he's also one of the Romantics. We are going to study his Biographia Literaria, what he has to say about imagination and fancy, and what is his conception of poetry, what is his conception of the nature of poetry, and all this poetic diction. Coleridge की poetry fanciful poetry थी, इसमें supernatural element भी था, and he's mostly known for his good oration. He was a good speaker, he was very talkative, and he has a lot to say about these great people, these great poets like Shakespeare and Wordsworth, and we're going to discuss what he has to say about Wordsworth and Shakespeare as well. So until we meet again, thank you.